Today in our studio we have Kena Nайлса, who is Assistant Director of the Department of Energy and the head of Hanford program. Welcome.
Thank you.
Why we are concerned about the problem that's located in Washington?
It's mainly because of the Columbia River. So Hanford is about 40 miles of the Columbia River runs through the Hanford site. They use the Columbia River as a disposal for liquid waste. If you go back into the 50s and 60s, there were definite impacts to the river from a negative aspect. And we want to make sure that as cleanup progresses over the next several decades, that there aren't impacts to the Columbia River in the future.
How easy is to get updates and information from Hanford?
It has definitely changed since I first started working with the agency. We were not invited to meetings. We were not shared a lot of documents. Through a lot of effort and a lot of years, we've changed that. We have formal agreements with the Washington Department of Ecology and the U.S. Department of Energy for them to share certain documents with us. We do get periodic briefings. I can call up the Hanford manager and ask questions and do that. We don't know everything. There are certainly negotiations among the agencies that are legally involved with the cleanup that they don't share with us at the outset. But I think for the most part we have a really good understanding of what's going on.
Can you share with us the current status of the toxic cleanup and the radiological cleanup at Hanford?
Yeah, we're 30 years into the cleanup. Just passed that milestone in May. Right today, I would say in a lot of respects, it's more uncertain than it's been in the last 30 years. A lot of the things that we've been anticipating would happen, the development of facilities to treat Hanford's most toxic waste. There has been a lot of information in the past year or two that really calls into question whether it's the right way to go. It will be so expensive and take so long that there is a lot of effort right now to look at other ways of doing things, which concerns us because in some cases those other ways may not be as protective. There is a heavy focus right now on the cost of cleanup and how to reduce the cost. And at times we feel that there is not enough focus on how do we maintain the quality of the cleanup.
What's the geological structure under Hanford?
The geology under Hanford is very complex. It was created through the Missoula floods and centuries and centuries of different upheavals. The center of the Hanford site is about 240 feet above groundwater. But they also dumped hundreds of billions of gallons of liquid waste into that soil. And so there are widespread contaminant plumes within the groundwater of different chemicals and different radioactive materials. What they have been doing for the last 20 or 25 years is there's been a really strong focus on containment. They've been able to, through the use of technology called pump and treat, where they install groundwater wells, pump out the water, run it through treatment, and then re-inject the water, they've been able to shrink those contaminant plumes and pull most of it off the river. There's still some amounts of both radioactive material and chemicals getting into the river in very small amounts that if you get more than a few feet away from those entry points, you can't detect it. The river dilutes it so much. But it definitely was a concern, especially, people think of the radioactive material and stuff. There was a chemical used called hexavalent chromium, which was used to purify the water that went into the reactors to remove the heat. And it was used and spilled in thousands and thousands of gallons. And it's very toxic to fish. So in the early 90s or so, there was a real realization that the chromium was getting into the river at virtually every one of the reactor areas at Hanford. And that became one of the big focuses. And it really, in a lot of respects, is one of the bigger successes in the Hanford cleanup, that they have been able to shrink those contaminant plumes and pull those plumes off the river.
Is it safe to eat the fish?
It is safe.
Portland also gets lots of organic produce from the Tri-City area.
Yes.
So the Russian people are asking, is it safe to eat this produce?
It is absolutely safe. They're very aware of this multi-billion-dollar agricultural industry and its importance of keeping it clean and uncontaminated. And so there is a lot of testing to make sure that the irrigation water that's pulled out of the river does not have contaminants, and it is safe to eat.
Good news.
Yes.
Are there any potential dangers that public should pay attention to?
There are a few. Through the course of the 30 years of cleanup, some of those immediate risk things have been eliminated, and it certainly is a safer place in that respect today than it was 30 years ago. At the same time, those facilities are 30 years older. A couple of years ago, we had a partial collapse of a storage tunnel that drew a lot of excitement, and it is an indicator that the infrastructure is crumbling at Hanford. I mean, some of these facilities date back to the 1940s and 1950s. But right now, there's a couple things that if you had a fire, if you had an earthquake, you had something like that, you could potentially end up with a release of radioactive material into the environment. It would be relatively small, most likely because it would not have a driving force to really move it any great distance. Oregon works with the state of Washington, with our counties. We have a nuclear emergency preparedness program. In the event that there's an accident there, we have things that we practice every year of what to do to track the plume, to contain the contaminants, to make sure that people aren't exposed.
If people get exposed, do we have the program in place, like give them supplements like iodine or something like that, or not?
I would say that I don't believe there would be the exposures because the plans that are in place to control the agriculture, if in fact there was a spread, I think those are strong enough that people would not be exposed in that respect.
Do we have a schedule of the cleanup for the future?
So when the original Hanford cleanup was signed, the cleanup agreement was signed 30 years ago, they anticipated at that time about 30 years.
So now?
So
be done.
But now we're looking at 2060, 2070. There's even some scenarios that run into 2102 or 2105. So we don't know, and it is dependent upon Congress to continue to appropriate funds every year for the cleanup. Hanford gets a lot of money. They get about $2.4 billion a year. And hard as that is to believe, that's not nearly enough for what they need to do.
What's in your eyes the future look for Hanford?
So let me kind of reverse that. So the reason we're involved and what we look at in terms of potential impacts, it's really difficult to quantify what the impact might be at Hanford if cleanup is not done correctly in the next 30 or 40 or 50 years. There is a potential for impacts to the river in 300 years or 500 years or 1,000 years. We can't really quantify it because there's so much uncertainty involved with that. But that's why we really want to focus on the cleanup today and over the next few decades to protect the river in the future. Looking into the future, I know that the Native American tribes who have used Hanford for thousands and thousands of years would love to be able to go back and use those natural resources. The Tri-Cities community, the three cities most immediate to Hanford, they look at Hanford, a cleaned up Hanford, as opportunity for development, as opportunity for tourism. The B reactor at Hanford, which was the first reactor, is now part of a national park. They're expanding those opportunities for the public to get out and see and use that site. There is what's called the Comprehensive Land Use Plan, which is about a 20-year-old document that says this part of the site will be in the future used for hiking and camping, this part will be used for mining, and all these different things. But who knows?
Can you tell us about the technology of kind of like preserving the waste?
So the cleanup is kind of a misnomer in some ways. If you have a radioactive material that's radioactive for 100 years or 1,000 years, you can't change those properties. So what you're trying to do is get it out of an environment or a form that is easily, exposes a person. So turning a liquid to a solid or a powder to a solid, getting stuff out from burial grounds right near the Columbia River and isolating them. Going back to the uncertainty of what will happen with Hanford's tank waste, which is the most toxic waste that they have at Hanford. For the last 30 years, there has been the expectation it will be turned to glass through a process called vitrification. So they would heat the waste and glass-making materials to form a molten glass. It would be poured into stainless steel canisters and will harden. It would still be radioactive, but it would be a lot more manageable.
Will it still be at Hanford? Or was somebody thinking about moving it somewhere else?
So again, with the plan that we've been looking at for 30 years, which again could change, is that they would split this waste into two waste streams. So there would be one waste stream with small amounts of radioactivity, large volumes. That would be vitrified and buried at Hanford. The highly radioactive glass would eventually go to a national geologic disposal facility, which we don't currently have.
Do we have any idea what state it will be located?
Well, the federal government had looked at a site in Nevada called Yucca Mountain for years and years. Nevada has opposed that very strongly. I think a lot of us feel that Yucca Mountain will never happen. There's a couple of sites looking at potentially some surface interim storage, one in New Mexico, one in Texas, but we don't know whether those will happen.
So if the Yucca Mountain or equivalent is going to happen, how we are going to transport this waste? Is it going to go through Oregon?
It would, yes, it would, in all likelihood. Just because when you look at where Hanford's located and where the rest of the country is, you kind of go through northeast Oregon to get there. What a lot of people don't understand is we have a shut down nuclear power plant northwest of Portland called Trojan, which currently has its spent nuclear fuel stored there. And if there is a Yucca Mountain, that fuel as well would be transported. Transportation of radioactive materials is something I've worked on for about 27 years. There are things that we have, the Western states collectively, and the states around the country collectively, have worked with the U.S. Department of Energy to get certain conditions met. What we would consider, I think most people would consider common sense provisions beyond the regulatory requirements. So you have, if it's going by truck, you have the most highly trained drivers, you have the most well-maintained equipment. You have procedures in place that even if the road is open, if the weather conditions are questionable, those trucks don't go that day. So there are things that I have confidence in terms of the ability of the U.S. Department of Energy to transport not only waste out of Hanford, but also the waste out of Trojan and do it safely.
What would you like to share with the Russian-speaking American community of Portland and Vancouver regards Hanford?
Regards Hanford, Hanford periodically shows up in the news media, and when it does, it's usually bad news. And it has earned the bad news. It has done some wrong things. I think the thing to convey is that the risks there are well identified. There has been a lot of progress made already in reducing those risks. and we'll continue to see progress in the next few years to hopefully eliminate a lot of those risks.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Sure.
That was very useful interview.
Good, thank you.
And I hope our Russian community or Russian-speaking community would be glad to hear the information.
Good,
Thanks
thank you
a
very
lot.
much. Thanks for the opportunity.